My name is Rick Mangi. I live in Brooklyn. I've been here in Brooklyn for almost 30 years. I grew up on computers. I was fortunate enough to be in middle school, I think, maybe end of elementary school when the Apple II Plus came out, and also fortunate enough to have one at home, and just like took to it, right? And I went to school for computer science and graduated just as I was a senior when the web happened, and I was actually double majoring in sociology, so like the convergence of the computers and people were just like it. So I came to New York because it was that or San Francisco, and my mom lived here. That's the only place you could really be in this industry back then, right? And yeah, I mean, started off, where we had to rack the computers and go down the data center, and I've been fortunate enough to see that evolve to what we now call SRE, I guess, which is really a brand new thing, and I'm not sure where it's going to go.
Yeah, it's funny how similar our stories are. We both went to the University of Colorado.
Yeah, go Buffs.
I was fortunate enough to have an Apple II GS when I was quite young. I got to hack around on that and play around with some Apple Basic, copied out of the back of magazines and that sort of fun stuff. And yeah, it's kind of funny, the overlap. But so let's start with DevOps. What is DevOps? Is DevOps a job? Is DevOps a tool? Is DevOps what in your opinion?
Yeah, I think it's a department. I mean, it's a group. I don't think there's such a thing as like I've never called myself anything but a software engineer, right? And I've played every role from, webmaster. I guess that was the one job title that I did like because it was kind of cool, webmaster. Yeah. But everything from back end, front end, systems, networking, all that stuff. It's how those different practices group together in individuals, right? And then we create departments out of that. So DevOps, we used to call it just systems, right? It was like the systems team, right? And they were responsible for setting up the firewalls and DNS and racking the servers and stuff. And then we automated that away, right? And we started doing it with code, and then we called that DevOps, right? But it's all the same skills. You still have to know how DNS works to administer it through code, right? Like maybe even more so, and so DevOps, I think, is more just like a department in an organization. I know people do, I'm a DevOps engineer because you're currently assigned to that department, right? But, more often than not, like, I think some people go really drawn to that aspect of programming, but I also find, like, I never set out to be an SRE. Like, it was not a goal of mine, kind of backed into it. I found myself managing a DevOps group, along with a platform group, and then somehow that qualified me as an SRE, I guess, when I came to Datadog, which is the first place I've been where we actually had an SRE group, because I think that's a very new phenomenon. Although I think it's been practiced for a long time. We've just given it a name now.
Yeah, and that's something that I think we like to do in this industry is slap a new coat of paint on some old ideas every now and again and trot it out.
We name things before we decide what they mean, right? Yes. Like we name things and then let it evolve.
Naming things is one of the hardest problems in computer science, right?
Absolutely.
And I think that's true. And in my experience with DevOps, it's really kind of you can't have the department until you have the culture, right? There's a cultural aspect to it. You have to have people that believe in doing work to reduce the amount of developer toil, right? Make it so that you're automating the things that can be automated, so that you're focused on what differentiates you as a business, right? The actual secret sauce of your business.
Yeah, I mean, so often we just start doing a bunch of work and we say, oh, this work is now really, really important to the company, and this person over here is doing it all the time. So let's kind of, whoa, that was weird. Let's wrap that up and call it a role, because it's that important. People were practicing security from day one, right? But not many companies until recently really see security as an actual job function. DevOps just kind of happened, and we decided to call it DevOps. Oh well, okay. Hopefully you can hear me.
Yeah, I think it's
just coming in and out.
It's all good. Yeah, and I mean, I remember writing code 2004, 2005, and you didn't have a lot of these things that we take for granted now. Like, like good version control that everyone uses and has adopted, right? If you've ever had to request to check out a file from Visual Source Safe that someone else has checked out and had checked out for 90 days, you know what I'm talking about? If you used SVN and then switched to Git, right? If you used to have to get all of the code and bundle it manually and then run your test suite and then deploy it by hand, all of that stuff. It's awesome that we don't have to worry about that as developers, but we do, right? We have to worry about creating the culture where you actually get those tools implemented, where it's not, oh, I need to see lines of code produced and put in production, rather than you automating this thing away.
It's interesting. You just touched on something that just clicked in my head, like Git, right? We can't really formalize things unless we standardize them frequently, and Git made version control problems go away and opened up for GitOps, right? I remember I was at MTV maybe 12 years ago or so on the platform team. So platform teams aren't new, and we were maintaining Subversion, and we literally had read replicas for Subversion, and it was going down all the time. And we only had maybe 1,000 engineers, but scaling version control was a problem until Git came along. And then all of a sudden, Git became like the most reliable place to put data, that you wanted to share between projects, and GitOps came out of that, right? And I'm sure someone did it before they named it GitOps.
Yes, right? And the funny thing is, like in my opinion, Git is kind of a terrible tool in many ways. Like
it's really complicated.
I have to look up half the things that I do in Git, right? But it solved the problem in such a way that it got wide adoption. So one thing I want to mention is how many of you in the audience think you have a healthy DevOps culture at your business? That's not as many hands as I wanted to see. How many of you are familiar with the book Accelerate by Nicole Forsgren and Jez Humble and Gene Kim? Okay, if you're one of those people who didn't raise their hand a second ago and you haven't read that book, I strongly encourage you to check that one out. It's, in my opinion, the best example of describing what really enables the culture, and it's all research backed. So there's numbers, and it's written by people with PhDs, so you can trust what they're saying. But I recommend that if you're struggling with this, for sure. Yeah,
it's a really good way. The book lays out a good business use case for adopting DevOps as a culture, right? It draws a direct line between being able to push code safely, securely, and quickly, and observe your running applications, and how that increases the business value, which is the point for most of us.
So I think SRE, especially Google popularized SRE. They had the SRE book. If you haven't read it, check it out. It's widely available, and it's a good read. And it's quite prescriptive. You don't have to do everything the way that Google does it. But I think it's fair to say that, in my opinion, I think SRE is an implementation of DevOps principles. It's not something different. It's just, here's how we're going to take these things that DevOps stands for and put them into practice. And Rick, I don't know if you think that's accurate. SRE is kind of an implementation of the values of DevOps.
I keep, especially for the last few weeks since they asked me to do this talk, I've been going back and forth in my head about what SRE means. And actually, just about a month ago, we had our SRE summit internally at Datadog, where we got all the SREs together. Because we're very distributed, and I give a presentation on the platform that my team's been building with an SRE mindset behind it, right? So I feel like SRE and DevOps are different. DevOps is part of SRE, but SRE really, in my mind, is more applicable to larger companies that have the flexibility and the ability, the power to actually invest in 1 year, 2 year projects that are not providing direct product enhancements, yes. Right? You're working on just making everything better. And again, it's not to say that companies haven't been doing this forever, but specifically around scaling, services, right? And the thing that comes to mind for me is a lot of what we do. If you think about the development lifecycle of software, the SRE team or the DevOps team spends way more time with the code than the people who wrote it, right? Like I see SRE as the people who have to maintain and operate the code over a long period of time get a say in how you build this thing, right? And that's, that's something that I spent most of my career in startups, by the way. Like out of, 30 years in the industry, I think 24 have been in startups. And, 2 of those are, the other 2 are Datadog and MTV. I was at Tumblr for a little bit, but I was a manager there. I wasn't an IC, it doesn't count. But yeah, I mean, when I was at startups, you tell your boss, like, hey, I want to spend a year building this thing that's, going to make everything 10% faster. And they're like, get the hell out of here.
We have 8 months of runway.
Yeah, like we might not be in business in a year. Are you kidding me? We need these 10 features, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, and that's my experience too. I've spent about half of my career at startups, otherwise at small agencies, brief detour over to AWS, and then I ended up at Datadog through a startup that got acquired. So I also come from startups. And something that, while we were planning for this session, that you said that really resonated with me is that what you just explained was that the ability to invest in effective SRE is a function of scale and company value, and like valuation in some regards.
Value and valuation, right? Both. Like, and I think it's one of these interesting things that came out of our industry specifically, around cloud and internet. Like, you don't need to be running in the cloud, obviously, to have an SRE, company. Plenty of my friends at banks are still highly, on-prem, and they have SRE. But yeah, it's about, building that long-term reliability of a project, not just getting it out the door and adding a feature.
So is there anything, in your opinion, that's interesting about how Datadog implements SRE principles? Is there something that you think is unique?
Yeah, I mean, we're still learning it, right? Like, we're still figuring it out. I mean, the cool thing about working at Datadog, and one of the things that attracted me to Datadog, besides it's like, I love the product, I would use it. And for me, I have to love the product that I'm working on. But it's like a startup that hit home. So we still have a lot of startup baggage and ways of doing things. And part of that is, a lot of tech debt, but part of it is also we're still figuring out the culture, and we're still figuring out the process of how we do it. So when we started an SRE group, it was focused on, really more the first kind of 2 tenets of, incident response. Like, let's formalize how we do incident response. Let's formalize how we fix things, right? And then a lot of remediation, right? We had a lot of legacy stuff that was crashing a lot or wasn't reliable, and so a lot of embedding, right, and getting in there. And we've recently started exploring more, kind of what I see as the third bit, which is building platforms that are for your developers to build more reliable software, right? And the first example was we have a chaos engineering team, that does some great work with the Kubernetes chaos controller, and lets us run game days and stuff, which is something we do a lot. But I don't know if anything that we do is unique or different, because I have no idea how anyone else does anything except for Google, really. And it's everyone does it different. That's the thing about process, right? Like, even like Agile, right? Dirty word, whatever. I did waterfall, it sucked. Agile's way better. But
XP, Scrum,
Scrum,
one, right?
all that, all that stuff. It's all kind of just, in my mind, a bunch of ideas that you should pick, choose, twist, and make your own, right? To fit your culture and how you work. Like, I was at an engineering leadership workshop that went on for a while, and a bunch of senior eng leaders in the city meeting once a week. It was a great workshop. But at the end of it, we're talking about managing teams and stuff. At the end of it, I said, no one has said the word Scrum Master. For like, because no one does that. Like, come on, like, no one does that. So SRE, like, the thing I like about the Google SRE book is it's like just a bunch of essays, right? And they're pretty straightforward about pick the ones that work and ignore the ones that don't. Like, here's error budgets, right? Like, we don't do error budgets. Yeah. I'm sure some people do and love them, but if it's not part of your culture, then don't worry about it. I think the one that we're really trying to figure out is like, what does it mean to embed in SRE, right? We kind of have two models. I'll probably think of a third. But, one is the traditional, like we have some engineers who join as SREs. And our SRE group, like, isn't kind of a formal hierarchy reporting structure, right? There's Leo's the director, but, people report to different groups within that. So there are folks that have been, came on as engineers to be embedded with specific core important teams on the back end to, like, be the SRE here, fix all the reliability problems. And that's worked great. And then we have kind of a guild type of thing, where a couple different, there's projects that span a few different teams, and we all kind of swarm on it, and each team assigns a few people, and frequently there are SREs embedded in there. So my team started off, I'm on the API reliability team. So my team is responsible for our API backends, soup to nuts. Like,
just a small little slice
of
the product there. Yeah.
I like to say it's the thing that the customers appreciate the most is when our APIs work, right? We're the most important thing. It's not the sexiest part of Datadog, honestly. Like, the folks who work on the core storage and the query engines and stuff, that's really, really neat stuff. We just write Python and Go APIs, right? But we were formed as an SRE team specifically to focus on the web stack. And that was a new thing for us. And it's grown. So it started off, there were 5 of us. We kind of split off from another team that was doing all of our authentication APIs. 5 of us, and our mission was just like, start off by figuring out what's wrong with our web stack and make it better. Like, make the CI work better, make the reliability better, and figure out what else needs to happen. And this is some of the oldest, there's code that Alexei wrote in there. It's like the original, like, login a Datadog, right? So there's some old code in there. And that has proven to be really incredible because we've grown it from one team, we called it the Web Reliability Engineering Team. So Spider-Man's our avatar because it's webs, right? Now it's the API platform team. And I think we have 4 or 5 teams, with like 4 or 5, 6 engineers each. And we're building our own in-house API framework. That is, I'm kind of advertising it as half API framework, like a Flask type of thing in Go. And then the other half is our SRE layer. It's the glue that attaches your runtime to Datadog, right? Because that's half the problem is deploy. Like, anyone can write a web stack, write an API that records the right metrics, just like every other API that Datadog does, because we want to be able to track all these things together. Adds tracing correctly, logging correctly, Helm charts, runs in all of our data centers appropriately, follows all of our deployment. We do zonal deploys by data center, and there's an order of operations. All this stuff, autoscaler, this is all, it's way more complicated to glue everything together than it is to just build an app.
Do you think that's, well, first of all, how many people here like spend way too much time on Twitter like me? Anyone? Now, I know Twitter is not as cool as it used to be, but there was recently some Twitter discourse. There's always Twitter discourse, but there was some DevOps-related discourse. Some startup somewhere posted an article saying, DevOps is dead. It's been replaced by platform engineering.
Someone just told me this the other day. So I was talking about SRE. It might have even been here, someone yesterday. I hope they're not. A friend of mine, I think he said he was blowing me off for my talk, so whatever. He's not my friend anymore. But he said, yeah, wait, what's the other thing that everyone's talking about now? And I was like, platforms? He's like, yeah, that's it. I'm like,
yeah, another coat of paint.
I mean, I think platforms is like and when I say platforms, new term, it's not, but it's providing an internal service, like it's SaaS for an internal thing, right? It's one way to think about it. And we're moving everything to platforms for the most part. But it's been something that people have been trying to do forever. Yeah. And again, it's one of those cases where can you invest in building this? And usually it's some API stack or my last job, and there's a fine line between platform and just standard framework, right? And I think the dividing line is when there's a team that actually owns it and maintains it, right? Okay. So Google is, I think they're probably, again, the best example of a team that has taken this to an extreme, or a company that's taken it to an extreme. I've never worked at Google, but a lot of my friends, a lot of my coworkers come from Google, and there it's everything's a platform, right? You want to, change some runtime parameter, well, there's a platform for that, right? And you use that platform, and you own your silo and your platform. And I think we're trying to find a nice balance between those two. But yeah, having engineers focused on one core piece of running software at a time is great until it doesn't scale, right? So there's the scaling question again. We could just have a DevOps team for every app, but that doesn't scale. So we have SRE. We try to have one team kind of support dozens of apps, right? And same with platforms, right? You need to have enough customers internally. And we spend a lot of time internally, I know a lot of big companies are like this. You spend a lot of time selling your platform or your product internally. Yeah. I don't get to talk to actual customers. All my customers are product teams. Yeah.
So we can open things up for questions. Yeah, please don't be shy. Yell, come up. There's a microphone over there that you can queue up at if you want. It seems like there's a lot of people who have questions. So please head that way. I set up a Slido to collect questions, but honestly, I think that's going to be more complicated than we need. So we'll skip that if no one minds. You didn't even know it was going to happen, so of course you don't mind. But yes, can we get the Q&A microphone turned on, please? All right, thank you. All right, what's your question? Testing. I can hear you, but I don't know if the mic's on. Speak loudly, and I'll repeat the question.
And then they're just a DevOps engineer again, right? Yeah. That's actually something that we're trying to figure out. How do you define success? And I think it comes down to figuring out your success metrics before you start the embed, right? So we're embedding this person, and the goal is to decrease, latency by 10% in 6 months, right? And then we're going to reevaluate. So that's the other thing, have a reevaluation period where you have an opportunity to take this person back, if they're being turned into a DevOps person,
All right, thanks.
Cool.
Did everyone hear that question?
Oh, yeah, we didn't.
Yeah, basically was asking if you have embedded SREs at a company that's rapidly scaling, how do you essentially standardize the role, the definition of the role, so that you get buy-in within each of those teams that they're embedded on, so that they don't just end up reverting back to a DevOps engineer rather than a member of the SRE org. Yeah.
So you took a survey in the beginning and asked how many of you think you have a good DevOps culture, and very few people had their hands up. And do you have any advice on how to turn that around? And I'm more curious specifically on what's a good ratio? I know this is a simplistic statistic, but what's a good ratio between a top-down or bottoms-up approach to turning that around? Is there a 50-50 top-down, or make it more organic?
Top-down what?
In terms of leading initiatives, do you see
is it change the culture from the bottom up or from the top down, right?
Oh.
Yeah. This might come back to,
Yeah.
first of all, I think it depends largely on scale, right? So like the
It
size
depends
of
on
your company.
scale, and it depends on what it is about the culture that's broken. And I don't think this is DevOps specific, right? Bad company cultures are bad company cultures, and it's usually a top-down problem in my mind. I don't know your specific case, but I've had the most common one that I hear is the DevOps guys are kind of they're the ones who get woken up every night. They're the ones who are always on call complaining, no, we need to fix this because it keeps paging everybody, and that's not right. And then the product people are like, well, but we need new features, right? And we don't have time to invest in that. We had a case at my last company. We were in a situation where we were getting paged all the time, right? We convinced, and this was a startup, so we could get away with it, and we had our CTO's buy-in, and he helped. We made our CEO hold a pager, and he got woken up every time we did. And it took about a week before he let us really just focus on fixing stuff.
I can give you an example from my experience from the bottom up at SendGrid. So I was at SendGrid when there was a 30-person startup, was there for 5.5 years on the dev advocacy side. But because the company was so early on, a lot of that was product. To go out in the field, talk about the product, hear feedback, bring it back. One of the things that I ended up doing was owning all of the documentation. And at the time at SendGrid, engineering hadn't really implemented a lot of the DevOps principles and culture that we needed to move quickly. And I got frustrated with it, and I kept running into walls where I would try and get things set up for like continuous deploy, and I just would run into walls. So with the documentation, which was something I became the product owner for, I basically just went off course. I said, well, if your platform won't allow me to do this, I'm going to kind of go around the rules, because this is the right way to do it. So the documentation at SendGrid became the first continuously deployed piece of software. And then I was able to model that behavior to everyone else and say, I know you have reasons why you didn't want me to do this on the platform, but it works fine over here, so let's talk about that and work it out. So I think if you're at a small enough startup, people are scrappy and you have that agility, then model the behavior that you want to see changed as much as you can.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, the nice thing about startups is you have the flexibility to kind of, just make decisions and do it, right?
And if not, buy your CEO a pager.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
These are great questions, by the way. Thank you
Absolutely.
for the participation, everyone.
Hi, my name is Peter. I've been a SRE across 3 different companies over the past maybe 5 or 6 years. So I understand from like the Google SRE book that there's lots of, and just like the internet in general, and everyone has an opinion. There's lots of aspirational things that like people think an SRE team or SRE people should do. But I want to focus on what you guys think. I'm looking for spicy opinions here. Things that SRE folks should not do. For example, I've seen in a lot of companies that SRE folks are being set up as like just basically janitors for like devs or like a DevOps, kind of folks. That sucks. That's clown shoes to me. So I'm curious, like, what you guys think is like, don't do this. Do not do this. Bad culture. Bad.
I mean, the first thing that pops into my head is, the goal is to automate everything, right? So SRE should not be manually running scripts at assigned times in the morning when their like little calendar reminder goes off and says run the backup script, right? Should not be doing that. Should not be scraping data for spreadsheets for the CFO to like see how much stuff costs, right? Use Datadog for that, but again, I'll say like in a real quote unquote real SRE organization, you have 3 roles that are being performed by SRE types, and one of those is DevOps, right? So there's always some level of like grunt work that DevOps does, right? But the goal should always be, let's automate this. I always say, a best practice is some code I haven't written yet, and that, I think that's the mindset. So the number one thing for me would be don't be running bash scripts by hand, or doing any manual work.
I would say hopefully that applies to just dev work in general these days.
Yeah.
For me, like the first time I do something, it's kind of hack it. The second time I do it, I document it. The third time I do it, I strongly consider automating it.
I love that you document before you automate. That's awesome.
Oh, of course, yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. I have an English literature degree. I love writing. I own the documentation at SendGrid. It's one of my things that is often overlooked by other developers, so I kind of tend to focus on it a bit.
Nice.
Cool, thank you.
Thank
Awesome.
you.
Hi. So I've only been an SRE for about a year now, and you both mentioned Git. And Git is a great example of a tool that you learn once, and you're probably going to use it at your next job and for a long time,
Yeah.
right? So in both of your experience, are there any tools that, I mean, there are a lot of tools to learn, often that can feel a little overwhelming. So in your experience, are there any tools or just high-level principles that have stood the test of time and share that characteristic, the same characteristic as Git? And are there any tools that you would bet on being around in the next 5 years?
I can think of a lot of tools that I use that predate Git that will last longer than Git, right? Like all the basic Unix tools, right? Like, sed and awk, like they're going to be around long after I'm gone, I think. Git won't. Git will be replaced in the next 10 years. That's my hot take. I don't know by what, but that just seems like the normal progression. And same with Kubernetes, by the way. Like Kubernetes is super hot right now. Fantastic. I mean, we run everything in Kubernetes, but it's so complicated. And I don't know that it's not going to have some serious competitors pretty soon. I mean, it crushed Mesos, which hurt me deeply because I gave talk on Mesos at an Apache conference. But
For me, it's kind of less about the specific technologies and more about the mindset, right? If you understand systems thinking, if you can break problems down into smaller problems until you can reason about them and solve them, that's always going to serve you well, regardless of that shifting sands of technology landscape, right?
yeah, I 100% agree. Nothing in computers has changed since I was 12 years old, right? Like, I should back up. As soon as I had a 300 baud modem, nothing has changed since then, right? Like, everything still works the exact same way. We have GPUs and we have the cloud and stuff, but like understanding fundamentally, HTTP protocol, right? TCP protocol, how DNS works, how the internet works, how a computer organization, how Unix works, pipes and all that stuff. Like, that is way more important than any single tool that you can learn.
Yeah, and all of the progress, all the faster chips, the bigger hard drives, the cheaper storage, the cloud, all of that, we just use that to abstract away layers of difficulty.
I mean, we're
and
even coming
improve
back.
the developer experience. And then that's what will happen to Git, that's what will happen to Kubernetes.
And it's cyclical, right? Like I'm not the first one to say, like, we're going back to time sharing, right? With the cloud, like, we've gone full circle.
Yeah, I used to rent cycles on a mainframe, and now you kind of do the same thing.
Now you do it in AWS,
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Hey, I'm Ray. I'm a database engineer on a team that's been around for a long time, and I found myself wanting to kind of implement and evangelize DevOps practices, but the team's been around for a while, and it's been kind of difficult, So I was wondering, like, if you guys had any insights on, kind of like best practices or just like things that have been really helpful to like evangelize these.
Yeah,
practices.
I think we're thinking the same thing. Start a book club and buy everyone a copy of Accelerate and read it. I mean, honestly, if people aren't convinced after that, then you know that it's probably time to polish up the resume.
Yeah, my last company, we had a book club with the Google SRE book. Yeah, seriously, make everyone read that book. I mean, it lays out a real like non-engineer specific use case for why the stuff's important.
And it's all backed by research and data. So if people look at that and go like, oh, I don't think that's true, then you can say, well, here's the methodology.
Yeah, I mean, it's got the numbers and everything. It's really fascinating.
Otherwise, I would say if there are, again, similar to what I mentioned while I was at SendGrid, if there's a small piece where you can just grab that and start to model the behavior and show people here are the benefits that we're seeing as a result of the change. I know that's sometimes hard because you have to ask for forgiveness instead of permission, but if you're able to do so, I encourage you to take that approach.
Yeah.
All right, thank you.
Sure.
And I guess like one more small question. I've seen database reliability engineer roles at Datadog, and like I guess also there might be a team. I'm curious like how coupled you are with them. If you guys like share like learnings or practices, you know.
Oh yeah, I mean our SRE group, we have our tentacles everywhere. There's a lot of us, and we get involved in everything. So like our SRE team runs the incident response across all of Datadog. So, you know, if the database team has an outage, then, you know, they're part of that. So yeah.
All right, cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
Hey Rick, hi Brandon. This is Shubham, and I work as an SRE for a major news channel. So, I want to touch more about the topic of culture in the workspace, right? So, I end up finding myself switching a lot of hats. So, one day I'm SRE, one day I'm like doing some DevOps stuff, and a part of a trend that I've been observing is that like during these routine SRE tasks, right? So, you find out a problem, you find out like what went wrong, and then you reach out to the concerned platform teams to have those things fixed. But lately, what's been bothering me is that like the platform teams end up just duct taping the issue, and it's still there only for it to blow up at a later date. And my question in this regard is to how do I get that to turn around? Like how do I motivate the platform teams to to actually come up with a solution then rather than just duct taping?
You're I'm touching me deep here. You know, I mean, this is not unique to your company. I'm going to tell you something we did because we have the same problem as every other company, right? It's just that we don't have to pay ourselves for observability metric. So I told you my team was in charge of the platform, the API platform, right? So we were getting frustrated that some endpoints were really slow, you know? And it's like, guys, like this, we get pages for this endpoint all the time, and they won't fix it. They won't fix it. They won't fix it. We created an API reliability report in a Datadog notebook, of course, right? Which every week gets built and generated, and it has charts for here are like the 10 slowest APIs, here are the 10 with the most errors, you know, high error rates, here are the 10 that have the most ridiculous number of logs compared to what they actually do, because we care about the cost, right? You know, all that stuff, and we publish it. And, you know, that gives the teams visibility and gives the executives, the decision makers visibility into, you know, how our APIs are performing. And those teams, you know, I hope they feel a little, I don't want to say shame, but, you know, I think it has, a lot of them we found out, they were like, oh my God, we didn't realize it was that bad. You know, like, yeah, you slacked me that one time, but, you know, and when they see it publicly like that, you know, and they know everyone in the company sees whose endpoints are the slowest, it works.
Yeah, I was just going to say, make them feel some pain however you can. And that was kind of the doc story I told. Part of my goal was to shame the engineers, to say, like, this was not hard for me, and I'm not even on the engineering team. Why haven't you done it?
Yeah, I think most people want to do a good job, right? And they're all struggling to find the time to do everything. So part of it is just making the priorities change for the company culture.